morning. It is good to see each one of you here. Appreciate your presence and mindful of those who are not able to be with us this morning. When we think of the things that Jesus went through before suffering that death on the cross, our focus, our attention usually goes to the cross and his being nailed to that. Those nails that pierced his hands and his feet, the scourging that he endured before, the mocking, the ridicule, and then that soldier piercing his side. But what we don't think about, I don't believe often enough, is the events prior to all of that happening. I'm going to focus on that here this morning. And what just simply is the trials of Jesus. The trial and crucifixion of Jesus is the greatest miscarriages of justice in all the annals of time. In less than 12 hours, just before his crucifixion, Jesus was brought or put through a series of proceedings that give the term, a term that we use when somebody, something like this or similar happens to them. We use the term that they were railroaded. The things that happened to Jesus and the way that he was railroaded gives a whole new meaning to that term. First before Jewish officials, then before Roman authorities. Jesus was hauled into and before illegal assemblies, falsely accused, subjected to verbal and physical abuse. Finally sentenced to death by a weak politician who had pronounced him not guilty at least and probably 4 times and repeatedly has stated his intentions to release him. Not only did these trials violate a written law of Moses, but they violated civil laws that it had been designed to carry out the principles of a justice enjoined by the Mosaic law. I believe it is good for us to be aware of these things and these matters so that we may more fully appreciate what Jesus went through for us. And so that we may appreciate his love for us. And we may love him more deeply in return. Let's notice first some principles from the Mosaic Law. The establishment of guilt, especially in capital cases, was required by at least 2 witnesses. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 6, at the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is to die be put to death. At the mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death. A vote which would tend to protect the accusations from being fully proved. None would testify against anyone unless so deeply convinced of his guilt that they were willing to assume the responsibility of inflicting the same on them. And the last penalty, and that penalty would be on their heads. Verse 15 of Deuteronomy 19 says, one witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin, in any sin that he sinneth. At the mouth of two witnesses or at the mouth of three witnesses shall a matter be established. The rule of chapter 17 and verse 6 regarding idolatry is extended down here to verse 15 and to any accusation. A single witness was not to be admitted as significant to convict a man of any sin or any offenses, either civil or criminal. The accused was to have an impartial trial, including a diligent inquiry into the facts of the matter before them. Chapter 13 and verse 13, beginning, it says, certain base fellows are gone out from the midst of thee, and have drawn away the inhabitants of their city, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which ye may have not known. Then shalt thou inquire and make search and ask diligently, and behold, if it be truth and the thing certain, that such abomination is wrought in the midst of thee. These base fellows or children of Belial, or sons, meaning they're sons of worthlessness or utterly worthless persons. The inhabitants were being drawn away, And the meaning there of that verse means those words are being thrust, which conveys the idea of drawing away with some degree of force, not merely easy seduction, but impulsion by strong persuasion. After done with the inquiry, after they searched diligently and asked diligently, and if it was found that the thing that was being investigated had really been done in any of their cities, the penalty was to be inflicted to all its inhabitants. The judges were to seek justice and were forbidden to take bribes. This goes back to Exodus chapter 23 and verse 6 beginning. Thou shalt not wrest the justice due to thy poor in his cause. Keep thee far from a false matter, and the innocent and righteous slay thou not. For I will not justify the wicked. And thou shalt take no bribe, for a bribe blindeth them that have sight, and perverteth the words of the righteous. Going back up into verse 3, there was a warning not to favor the poor out of compassion for them. Here it is a warning against the opposite of verse 3. A more error, leaning against the poor in the evidence or with their decisions. Those feelings that were prohibited by these judges. Those feelings were not allowed to influence them. They were to steer clear of false accusations, or of the death, so the death of the innocent would not come. Verse 8, to take no bribe, because taking a bribe blinds them. This would defeat the very idea of justice and why justice exists. When it was detected, Josephus says of verse 8, when it was detected, it was punished capitally. So the judges, in other words, that took bribes to look one way or the other was punishable by death. Let's notice for just a few moments here some very specific Jewish laws intended to implement principles and laws of Moses. And through these laws that were put into place, you'll notice the similarities that many of ours have today from the Jewish laws. This information is from the Talmud, which is a book of Jewish law and some commentary upon it. The Sanhedrin, or the makeup of the Sanhedrin Council, intended to make it a well-rounded and impartial, consisted of 71 people. 23 priests, or religious leaders, of each of these. 23 scribes, which were legal experts. 23 elders, which were respected older men in the community. And then 2 presiding officers. So this is the Sanhedrin Council that Jesus was before. The qualifications of judges were strict. Both parents had to be Jews. They had to be well educated in the Mosaic law and Jewish tradition, as well as other subjects. They were gainfully employed or they were retired. And they had to be morally upright men. Judges had to be disinterested. Could not be a relative or heir of the accused. They could not stand to benefit in any way from the accused's death or condemnation. He goes to the prohibition against bribes, back up in Exodus 23. The vote on the guilt or innocence took place the day of the trial. Give emotions to time off. Let me rephrase that there in a word. The day after the trial. Missed a word on the PowerPoint there. The day after the trial gives emotions time to cool, time for deliberation and reflection on what was just presented. The accused was presumed innocent and could not compel or be compelled to testify against himself. False witnesses were subject to the penalty of the crime charged to the defendant. Deuteronomy 19, or text. An accomplice to the crime could not testify. All court proceedings were to occur during the day, between the morning and the evening sacrifices. They were to be in public, held in a public way, designed to help keep everyone honest, and they were not supposed to be in any crooked dealings in private at night. The balloting. When came time for the accused to receive their guilt or innocence was to begin with the youngest. So they couldn't be influenced by those who are older. Next, the judges or most experienced judge. And then would proceed upward to the high priest who voted last, keeping the younger less experienced judges from being intimidated or swayed in their voting. If the defendant was acquitted, the trial was over and the accused was released immediately. If a guilty verdict was reached in a capital case, it was automatically appealed the next day. Another vote was taken the next day. Judges could not change or could change their votes from convict to acquit. But they could not change from acquit to convict. There are many other procedural regulations that were laid out. But I think this is enough here to give us just a taste for what ought to have occurred in contrast to what did occur in the trials of Jesus. So first there are the Hebrew trials of Jesus. There was a preliminary examination before Annas. John chapter 18, verse 13 beginning there, says, and led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Verse 19, we'll talk more about Caiaphas here in just a few moments. The high priest, verse 19, the high priest therefore asked Jesus of his disciples and of his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I ever taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and in a secret spake I nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them that have heard me, what I spake unto them. Behold, these know the things which I said. And when he had said this, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus. There's the physical abuse here, the beginning of it, the physical abuse. Struck Jesus with his hand, saying, answerest thou to the high priest so? Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why smitest thou me? Annas therefore sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. This procedure, first of all here, was illegal according to Jewish law. The law did not allow for a preliminary examination of the accused. Only the witness played one witness played the role of prosecutor, and the accused could not be compelled to testify against himself. The officer that slapped Jesus without justification, the role of a judge was to protect the accused and to prevent this kind of abuse. So Annas then sends him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. The first trial before the Sanhedrin. Matthew chapter 26. Caiaphas here now presiding over this first trial. Verse 57 beginning reads, and they that had taken Jesus led him away to the house of Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. Now pay attention and carefully to the words of the reading here of Matthew. Caiaphas the high priest had taken Jesus and led him to the house of Caiaphas. Verse 58, but Peter followed him afar off into the court of the high priest and entered in and sat with the officers to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council sought false witness against Jesus that they might put him to death. And they found it not, though many false witnesses came. But afterward came two and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said unto him, answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witnesses against thee? But Jesus held his peace. And the high priest said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou art the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus saith unto him, thou hast said. Nevertheless, I say unto you, Henceforth ye shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of the heavens. Then the high priest rent his garment, saying, He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? They answered and said, He is worthy of death. Then did they spit in his face and buffet him, and some smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is it that struck thee? You see down through this reading here of Luke, they are in no way following Jewish law that was set in place. This procedure here before Caiaphas, it was an illegal procedure. It was at night. The law did not allow, again, for preliminary examination before Annas. Now he's before Caiaphas. Caiaphas was said to be the high priest. A high priest that was appointed by a Roman official, not by Jewish law. That is important to understand, to know. This place took at night and was not in public. It was at the house of Caiaphas. In Luke chapter 22 and at verse 54, it says, They seized him and led him away and brought him into the high priest's house. That's not a public proceeding. This is being done in private. There were not 71 men present at this time. The judges, again, were acting as prosecutors, actively seeking testimony, false testimony against Jesus. Verse 59 there of Matthew 26. They sought false witnesses against Jesus. Why? Because so far, with everything that has said, been Jesus, and they found none. They found nothing against him. Caiaphas then illegally put Jesus under oath and compelled him to testify, verse 63 of Matthew 26. The high priest, Caiaphas in this case, sinned. History knows him as Joseph Caiaphas. He was the high priest to serve after his father-in-law Annas, who was removed by Valerius Gratus, who was a Roman procurator. By the first century, the high priest, the office of the high priest, by the first century, near the end of first century and through, the high priest had become more of a political appointment controlled by kings and procurators. So Caiaphas was, in essence, an illegal high priest. Caiaphas then pronounced Jesus as guilty before a vote was taken, verse 65. He hath spoken blasphemy, he says. It was not evenly formally taken the way it was to be done by law. And notice again, verse 59, they sought these witnesses or false witnesses against Jesus. Why? That they may put him to death. And then blasphemy comes into play, and blasphemy was a capital offense punishable by death. But it was not blasphemous to claim to be the Messiah. Their view was simply that Jesus was claiming too close a kinship to God, or equating himself with God. This vote that was taken, and then verse 67, more physical abuse that occurred. They spit on him, they buffeted him. Some of them smote him with the palms of their hands. To have any pretense of a legal procedure, the court would have to been adjourned and taken up again the next morning. This is the first trial. Jesus' second trial before the Sanhedrin. Luke 22 and verse 66 beginning. And as soon as it was day, the assembly of the elders of the people were gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and led him away into their council, saying, If thou art the Christ, tell us. But he said unto them, If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from henceforth shall the Son of Man be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And they all said, Art thou the Son of God? And he said unto them, Ye say that I am. And they said, What further need we have of witnesses? For we ourselves have heard from his own mouth. This trial, again, was an illegal procedure. As soon as it was day, it says there, verse 66, which would indicate this was done before the morning sacrifice, making it too early for a trial. The accused, Jesus in the case, did not have the protection of public scrutiny. And keeping all of this in mind here of these rulers in the Sanhedrin, keep all of this in mind that they feared the people. Mark 12 and verse 12. And they sought to lay hold on him, and they feared the multitudes, for they perceived that he spake the parable against them, and they left him and went away. Luke 20 and verse 19 says, And the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him in that very hour, and they feared the people. Chapter 22 and verse 2, same thing. The chief priests and the scribes feared the people. They feared the people. If there was no fear of the people, they would have murdered Jesus long before this. And again, Luke's account here of Luke 22, they compelled Jesus to testify against himself, verse 67 and 70. Now, this first trial, second trial, now they must take him to Roman authorities for execution. They have pronounced his sentence of his guilt. And they said they don't need to hear anything else. He has spoken blasphemy. So now we look at the Roman trials of Jesus. Luke chapter 23 records for us the first appearance before Pilate. In verse 1 beginning, And the whole company of them rose up and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man perverting our nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, saying, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And he answered him and said, "Thou sayest." And Pilate said unto the chief priests and the multitudes, "I find no fault in this man." But they were more urgent, saying, "He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, and beginning from Galilee, even unto this place." But when Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man were from or a Galilean. And when he knew that he was of Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem in these days. Note the charge here. As there before the Roman officials, the charge now is not blasphemy. When at first they called him only an evildoer, Pilate told them to judge him according to their own law. John 18, verse 30 and 31. As he answered and said unto him, "If this man were an evildoer, we should not have delivered him unto thee." Pilate therefore said unto them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews said unto him, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." Verse 36 and 37 of John 18 here. Jesus is not acknowledging being king, but not an earthly king or a political king in any way. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence." Pilate said unto him, "Art thou a king then?" Jesus answered, "Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end have I been born, and to this end I am come into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice." So in Luke's account here in verse 4, in Luke chapter 23, we have Pilate's first acknowledgement that Jesus is not guilty. "I find no fault in this man." Pilate, in verse 7, wishing to pass the buck, so to speak, says, this is Herod's jurisdiction here, so I'm going to send him to Herod. Verse 8, beginning of Luke chapter 23, says, "Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was of a long time desirous to see him, because he had heard concerning him, and he had hoped to see some miracle done by him. And he questioned him in many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his soldiers set him at naught, and mocked him, and arraying him in a gorgeous apparel, sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before they were at enmity between themselves." So Herod sends him back to the lower court, so to speak, something similar to the way our courts will rule. Something is brought before the Supreme Court, and they decide not to take it up, it is sent back to the lower courts of where it came from. The Herod being talked about here is Herod Antipas, who had beheaded John the Baptist and had feared Jesus, that he was actually John risen from the dead. Herod wanted to see Jesus, verse 8, to perform some kind of miracle so he wanted to see him. He questioned Jesus extensively, but Jesus said nothing. Isaiah 53 and verse 7. Isaiah looking to these things that would happen to Jesus. says he was oppressed. Yet when he was afflicted, he opened not his mouth, as a lamb that is led to the slaughter. And as a sheep that before its shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. After abusing him and after mocking him, Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate with no stated verdict. Verse 13 then of Luke 23, we have Jesus' second appearance before Pilate. Verse 13, and Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said unto them, Ye brought unto me this man as one that perverteth the people. And behold, I, having examined him before you, found no fault in this man touching those things whereof ye accuse him. No, nor yet Herod, for he sent him back unto us. And behold, nothing worthy of death hath been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. But they cried out all together, saying, Away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas, one who for a certain insurrection made in the city, and for murder was cast into prison. And Pilate spake unto them again, desiring to release Jesus. But they shouted, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. And he said unto them the third time, Why? What evil hath this man done? I have found no cause of death in him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. But they were more urgent with loud voices, asking that he might be crucified, and their voices prevailed. And Pilate gave sentence that what they asked for should be done. And he released him that for insurrection and murder, and had been cast into prison, whom they asked for. But Jesus he delivered up to their will. The second acknowledgement, verse 14, that Jesus is not guilty. Pilate then also interprets Herod's inaction as meaning Herod found no crime that Jesus had committed either. So he says, verse 16, I will release him after I chastise him. Satisfy. Maybe this will satisfy the Jews. And then I'll release him. In keeping, and this is important to note here, in keeping with the custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover. Matthew records for us in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 19 that Pilate's wife had warned him to have nothing to do with Jesus. He says, and while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, Have thou nothing to do with this righteous man? For I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. Interrupting kind of these proceedings, his wife sent for him to tell him these things. Verse 20, the Jews demand that Pilate release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. They persuaded the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The more that they can get on their side, the more likely their demands are to be met. In John 19 and verse 4, the third acknowledgement that Jesus is not guilty, Pilate went out again and saith unto them, Behold, I bring him out unto you, that ye may know that I find no crime in him. This is after verse 1. This statement here in verse 4. After verse 1, there's that he scourges and abuses Jesus. And then in verse 5, he says, behold the man. Probably the statement made by Pilate here as an appeal to sympathy, as to say something of the such as, just look at this pathetic man standing here, beaten and bleeding. Isn't this enough? Why go any further? Look at this man standing here. But that, and Luke, we read there just a moment ago, verse 16, the chastising of Jesus here, that did not satisfy the Jews. Verse 6, and look at the fourth of John 19 here, the fourth acknowledgement that Jesus is not guilty. When therefore the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto him, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no crime in him. The Jewish leaders are not satisfied with the scourging that he endured. The abuses prior to this, they were not satisfied. They wanted Jesus to be crucified. So since Pilate insists on Jesus' innocence, the Jews then shift back to their real complaint of Jesus. Verse 7, that he said he is the Son of God. And this no doubt instilled a little fear into Pilate, because if he crucified him, he was about to crucify a God. Pilate, though, then verse 12, first part of verse 12, was more determined than ever to release Jesus. But Pilate released him, or delivered him, to be crucified. He finally tripped on a political question. Verse 12 says, upon this Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if thou release this man, thou art not Caesar's friend. Everyone that maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. And Pilate knew the penalty for himself. For going against Caesar. So this weak man, Matthew records for us, Matthew 27 and verse 24. So when Pilate saw that he prevailed nothing, but rather that a tumult was arising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this righteous man. See ye to it. Even he affirmed that Jesus was a just person. The very next verse, the Jews anxiously accepted the responsibility for his blood. They said, all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and our children. Peter pointed this very fact out to them just 50 days later on the day of Pentecost. They were willing to accept the responsibility for Jesus' blood. None of what they did held with Jewish law. But their hatred for one man drove them to have an innocent man killed. We're examining the accounts of the trials of Jesus. Should cause us to appreciate more deeply what he endured for us. I am to be more firmly convinced of his love for us. And in turn, we ought to love him with a greater devotion. Which should serve as evidence itself in our loving obedience to his will. Yes, Jesus suffered tremendously in the physical and in verbal abuse at the hands of lawless men because of hate. Again, in less than 12 hours, all of that took place. But he was willing to endure all of that for you, for me. So that we can live. So we can have hope. So we can have forgiveness. And that's what you can have this morning if you're outside of the body of Christ. By submitting to him and to his will, you can have the forgiveness of your sins, that hope of an eternal home, and Christ living in you. Or as an erring child of God, sin in your life that you need to repent of, the opportunity stands before you to come in obedience to him. If we can help you and encourage you to do so, why not come now while we stand and while we sing?